On Christmas Day, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev showed his countrymen that his position no longer exists and that all his powers, including control of nuclear weapons, have been transferred to President of the RSFSR, Boris Yeltsin. He left the Kremlin at 7 in the evening and lowered the red Soviet flag from the main building of the historic complex that has occupied the world for 70 years. It was an expected end to a collapse that lasted about 6 years and witnessed the decline of the previous strong state and its ruling party and the acquisition of a multifaceted and multidimensional crisis in all aspects of the lives of more than 300 million people who were citizens of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics extending from the Baltic Sea and the Polish borders in the west to the Pacific Ocean and the Korean border north to the east. The discussion about the details of the collapse, its causes, and the factors and personalities that played big and small roles in its occurrence has not stopped yet. The publication of hundreds of publications by politicians, historians, economic and military researchers on what happened in the last years of the Soviet Union will not stop the emergence of new documents and archival materials that add elements that were not known or sufficiently understood to the course of those years of Gorbachev's leadership of the Communist Party and the Soviet state, which is the stage that focuses learners more than others. Between 1985 and 1991, all forms of political, ideological, and national impasses that the Kremlin had succeeded in suppressing since the October 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and the establishment of the Union in 1922 surfaced. Nor will the questions of whether the Soviet Union have a real chance to survive as a unified political entity if Gorbachev and his new thinking on which the policy of perestroika, reconstruction, and glasnost, transparency, was based did not appear. Today, many historians see that the cause of the downfall has accompanied the Union since its establishment, and it includes variations ranging from a lack of public and individual liberties to the petrification of an economic model whose makers were deaf to the realities of the Russian and Soviet reality in general, which were not developed compared to Western countries. To the vast social and cultural differences between the nationalities that were cast in the Soviet iron mold. Gorbachev's massive reform attempt, and behind him the most prominent perestroika theorist, Alexander Yakovlev, who preferred to stay out of the limelight, was a bold, as much fanciful leap over decades of tyranny, party authoritarianism, and direct rule, to reach socialism with a human face or a Scandinavian-style democratic socialism. The Russians would not have been able to leap this wide and the West would not have forgiven the Soviet Union for engaging in planet-wide struggles against all Western policies and interests. It was a stormy journey punctuated by thoughts, dreams, nightmares, horror, and victories that can be described as an intensification of the entire course of the 20th century or the short century that begins with the First World War and ends with the fall of the Soviet Union, as defined by historian Erich Hobsbawm. Russia had a large share in drawing the details of this century, but rather directing and leading it in some moments and presenting a global model that challenged capitalism on the scale of the world, to end in a resounding collapse that current Russian President Vladimir Putin described as the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Whatever the case, going back to Gorbachev's short televised speech in the last days of the Soviet Union, that period seems as if centuries had passed and not just less than a third of a century. The fear that dominated after the disappearance of the Soviet Union and its absence as an element of global balance quickly turned into civil wars within the countries of the former Union, as happened in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Georgia, Moldavia, and Russia itself in the Caucasus region, or wars between those countries such as the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Not to mention the political unrest that has not subsided until today in Ukraine and Belarus. Just as the contagion of identity conflicts and national, ethnic, and religious affiliation from the Soviet interior to the outside, especially to the Balkans and the wars of the 1990s in the former Yugoslavia, so has the economic collapse and the discovery of the enormous difficulty of moving from a directed economy controlled by 5-year plans drawn up by bureaucrats who have little contact with reality and who respond to the dictates of their superiors and the calculations of these ideology. Their adherence to an expensive and difficult international position moved to the Eastern and Central European countries that decided to return to a market economy that they left with the entry of Soviet tanks at the end of World War II and the establishment of people's democracies and the formation of the Warsaw Pact and the socialist economic bloc Comecon, which seemed like a faint resemblance to the European Union. In addition to the internal elements of collapse, there is an agreement among scholars today that the Soviet state, with its institutions and method of work, would not have continued in the era of globalization, openness of markets, cross-border movement of capital and the information and communications revolution. And that a closed state is impossible to continue as a global pole, and that what North Korea can succeed in maintaining the ruling regime through complete isolation from the world, a country that extends over millions of square kilometers cannot do it. In other words, the Soviet model has played its historic role and has been retired. Despite the losses, bloodshed and poverty that characterized the 1990s in Eastern Europe and in Russia in particular, whose policy today, in the opinion of the Kremlin supporters, represents a project to prevent it from being kept in the back seat in international affairs that affect its security and economic interests. In addition to this, the Union is the story of the Soviet Union that cannot be summed up in a journey of calcification of a state, its death, and its failure to achieve the great slogans launched by the October Revolution. Rather, an important aspect of that journey was the global project that was based on achieving social justice and putting an end to the exploitation and enslavement practiced in uncontrolled capitalist frameworks. The end of the Soviet Union coincided with the encroachment of neoliberal projects led by U.S. President Ronald Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and considered an unmistakable sign of the loss of the Soviet model of its attractiveness and its ability to mobilize those affected by privatization and capital control in unions and parties that curb the market rush and its chaos in a manner in which the Soviet Union contributed to the establishment of the welfare state in the West. Seeking to contain labor and union pressure in the aftermath of World War II, when Stalin advised representatives of the European Communist parties to come forward and capture the banner of power thrown by the side of the road. Whoever looks at the electoral campaigns in Europe in particular and in the world will see the huge disparity between the racist, populist and anti-refugee propositions and everything that is different, and what the competition revolved around in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of the last century. It goes without saying that the fall of the Soviet flag launched a new and radically different phase in world history, with all its negatives and positives, and the need for study and reflection. On Christmas Day, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev showed his countrymen that his position no longer exists and that all his powers